12 races completed, 12 races to go. I don't know about you, but I'd call that mid-season, which means we're going to have a look at the 21 drivers that we've seen race during the 2025 Formula 1 season and rate how they're doing so far. I wanted to get you guys involved, so each of the drivers' ratings was determined by our little community. Over 500 of you voted, and then I averaged out the rating given to each driver. I'm not sure I personally agree with all of them, but we'll discuss that when we get to them. Going through the drivers in championship order, starting at the bottom of the pack is Jack Doohan, who we knew was doomed from the start because before the season even got underway, a 3-year contract for Franco Colapinto at Alpine meant that Jack was being asked in press conferences about when it was likely to end, rather than if he was looking forward to the season beginning. And I think we can all appreciate that's not the situation that you want to be in when you're trying to prove that you're worth a seat in the sport and learn how to be a Formula 1 driver for the first time. I know he smashed up the car a couple of times, Australia and then Suzuka free practice definitely didn't help his case, but all of the rookies have had their moments, and his pace relative to Gasly wasn't horrendous. I can understand the low rating given to Jack here, but I also feel quite bad for him, especially as the guy who's replaced him at Alpine hasn't done that much better. They both had 6 races. Jack's highest finish was 13th, Colapinto's highest finish 13th, which came in Canada, and from my memory, that's the only half-decent weekend he's had. I do feel like the Colapinto hype train has started to reach a fork in the tracks. Coming in at Williams last year and both being fast and entertaining rightly got us excited for what he could do. Then the damage costs started to pile up and the pace dropped off, but we gave him the rookie token, and at least we were still excited to see him come back onto the grid this year. But now that his Alpine career hasn't managed to get going in any meaningful way, he's now under pressure of possibly being replaced himself. And from one South American rookie to another, the current Formula 2 champion, Gabriel Bortalto, hasn't quite hit the ground running in the way I was expecting, given he won Formula 3 and Formula 2 in back-to-back campaigns. And I know that you can argue before Spain and the upgrades that Sauber brought there, the car was ridiculously slow, and you're right, but we have had 4 races since that upgrade, and he's only managed 4 points, which all came in Austria, compared to Nico Hulkenberg's 31 within the same 4-race time frame. There is a caveat that you could add to that. In terms of qualifying, he and Hulkenberg are level 6-6, so there's definitely pace in the car when he clicks with it, but he hasn't been able to convert that into solid races often enough. I know that he is a rookie, and we'll be saying this about a few of the drivers on this list. He gets a little bit of grace for that. He was unlucky with the strategy in Spain, but then spins and shunts in places like Canada and at Silverstone, which were clearly his fault and cost him when the car has been capable of points. At times, the speed has been there, but he hasn't been able to fully show it. A down-the-middle C grade is just about fair enough, but I really want to see him shine in the next 12 races. Which is similar to Bearman, really. Again, came in with a lot of hype around him after we saw him deliver 3 very good weekends of driving last year, scoring points for both Ferrari and Haas in 2024. So coming into this year, I think he would have had high expectations for himself. And in one respect, you could say, well, he hasn't scored points since Bahrain, and that stint from Miami through to Spain was a really poor run of results, but I'm not sure that tells the complete story because he's also out-qualified his much more experienced teammate 5 times. He's had some really bad luck at points this season, and he's finished 11th in all of the last 3 races. I might repeat myself when talking about Ocon later, but I think because the Haas cars never seem to find themselves as the best midfield car, but also they're never the worst midfield car, they seem to just go under the radar, although that might end up being a good thing because it's allowed Ollie Bearman the opportunity to learn his craft and look on par with Esteban Ocon most weekends without a wave of pressure coming his way too. Which, when you compare that to Tsunoda, who is currently drowning under a tsunami of pressure, you can understand why being out of the headlines is actually a good thing more often than not. Since the move up into the main team 2 races into the season, the Tsunoda that we've seen is almost unrecognizable to the Tsunoda that we saw at the start of last season, or even in the first 2 races of this season. The points he scored for Red Bull in Bahrain, Miami and Imola feel like a lifetime ago at this point, and when you look at the average qualifying gap between all of the teammates on the grid, it's usually 2, maybe 3 tenths. The gap between Tsunoda and Verstappen is over double that at 7 tenths of a second, which tells me he just cannot get to grips with that car. It doesn't help that the majority of the team who helped to build that car have now left the team, but it also feels like this is just another driver driver who's going to be eaten up and spit out of that seat alongside Max Verstappen. Which quite nicely leads us on to Liam Lawson, who I feel like is the most difficult driver to grade from the whole grid. 2 races in a Red Bull car, just 2, after having the high of being promoted and given the keys to the seat alongside Max Verstappen, to then being crushed after 2 races, one of which you finished in 12th place, which compared to Yuki's finishes in hindsight isn't actually too bad, and then just to be told that you're going back to the sister team must have been absolutely devastating. So I think it's fair that Liam had a little bit of a slump and had to rebuild himself throughout the 10 races since then. He managed points in Monaco and more notably Austria to put himself above Yuki Tsunoda in the standings now, which is hilarious. But on the flip side of that, he's being outdone by Hajar pretty consistently. And he's decided that driving into people is a more effective way of trying to get past them than actually overtaking them cleanly. Liam just needs the summer break, I think. He needs to reset his season and think of those final 10 races in the same way that he has his other stints in Formula 1. He needs to show that he's good enough to deserve a seat, outdo his teammate more often than not, and like the other Red Bull second seat rejects, start looking for a way out of the Red Bull stable. Now we're starting to get into some of the more senior drivers on the grid, and I was not expecting Carlos to be the lowest ranked of them halfway through the season. It's weird because he has scored points in 12 out of the 6 race weekends that we've had this year, but it just doesn't feel like he has. The spin in Australia certainly didn't help the start of his season, and hitting into Antonelli before DNFing in Bahrain just also wasn't a good look. In Imola, I was convinced that his season was finally about to get going though, as he qualified in 6th and finished in 8th, which is more like what we were expecting to see from Sainz this year, but in reality, it's still been pretty tough. Maybe he just got unlucky because as he finally felt like he was getting there with the car, even Albon's results have started to drop off since Imola, as the team has been focusing their efforts on 2026. But he's nowhere near as unlucky as the other Spaniard on the grid. Not only has Alonso out-qualified Stroll at every Grand Prix this season, but as of the last Grand Prix weekend, it's been a full year since Stroll started ahead of Alonso on merit. And yet, Lance Stroll is still ahead of him in the standings. How, you ask? Well, here's a speed round. Australia, he was the first car to arrive at a wet curb after Gasly put gravel all over it. China, he had a brake failure. Japan, he was 11th. Saudi Arabia, he was 11th. Miami, he was hit by Lawson. Imola, the safety car took him from 6th to 13th. Monaco, he had a power unit failure. So I think you'll agree it's been a rough start to the year. However, Aston Martin's upgrade breakthrough in Spain allowed Alonso to get his first points, and he scored points every weekend since, even if he still got pretty unlucky in Silverstone. However, at least he isn't still racing for Alpine, because for Pierre Gasly, this was supposed to be the first season as the clear #1 in the team that isn't just a sister team, having ousted Ocon to Haas. But unfortunately, it's an Alpine seat, which means whatever he does and however good he is, he's always going to be subject to the ridiculousness that happens off track at that team. He's had to deal with another boss change, the chaos that has been the seat beside him, and the fact that the car has been the worst on the grid this season. So the fact that he's still been able to get the car into the points 4 times from 12 is actually fairly impressive, especially considering how competitive the midfield is this season and some of the drivers that he's currently ahead of in the championship. I think that the C+ that we came to is actually maybe a little bit harsh, and I would have personally put him more in the B category, but maybe that's just some of my bias showing. Which won't be showing anymore as we now enter the biannual bash Lance Stroll section of the video, as right at the start of the year, there was a glimmer, a ray of hope that he might have come into the season actually wanting to be an F1 driver and driving pretty well. Back-to-back point-scoring finishes in the first 2 races of the season made Fernando Alonso get questioned, and we all sat up and took notice, only for him to finish last in Japan and outside of the points in every race since until Silverstone, where he thrived in the weather chaos. Apart from the Miami sprint, where he also came 5th. But forget that, because he just doesn't do anything anymore. He isn't crashing or grabbing the headlines for doing something ridiculous. He just qualifies badly and then runs around at the back of the pack and waits for everyone else to just mess up the race in front of him. His tactic is to wait for a safety car or for rain and then go for the slightly more risky strategy. And annoyingly, this is working because somehow he's still beating Alonso in the standings. From being the rookie that I talked about the least before the season started to now being the rookie that I talk about more than any other, Isaac Hajar has more than proved his worth in Formula One, even if he only managed to get that seat after Red Bull discarded Sergio Perez for being so bad, although he wasn't actually that bad now in hindsight. Even though he came second in F2 last year, he had nowhere near the buzz that the other rookies did around him, and yet here he is in the standings alongside much more experienced drivers whilst being in a comparable car. He's been solid in qualifying, carries that into the races, generally keeps himself out of trouble. He's been everything that you want from a Formula One driver and is already being talked about to replace Yuki Tsunoda in the main team. And to be honest, if he keeps this kind of pace up, you can't really have many arguments against that. As I mentioned when talking about Bearman, I think the rating of a C here goes to show that the great, if quiet, drives from Esteban Ocon are indeed going under the radar, because there is no way that Ocon should have the same grade as Bortalto, Bearman and Alonso so far in this video. He scored points in 5 races this season, which is the same as Isaac Hajar, who you just gave a B+. I know he's a rookie, but considering that he's been tasked with taking Hulkenberg's spot within the Haas team, it's his first season with that team, and the car has been very up and down depending on the track, I think he's done a decent job of being the experienced driver within the setup, supporting Ollie Bearman and getting the points on the board when the opportunities have arisen. I might be wrong, but I can only think of Japan, where he was egregiously off the pace of where he should have been, and apart from that, he's continued to be his Ocon self, in that he's probably one of the best safe pair of hands on the grid. He gets 7 out of 10 performances weekend after weekend, with a few standout weekends here and there where he nabs podiums in Alpines, but I suppose it doesn't really grab the headlines, which is why he's ended up with a C grade, when I think he should have been at least a B. And I also do wonder what the grade would have been like without the podium finish in Silverstone for Nico Hulkenberg, because as we mentioned with Bortalto, Sauber's season didn't really get started until Spain. Prior to the Spanish Grand Prix, Hulk had scored points just once in 8 races, and that was in Australia, mainly due to him just being able to keep the car on the track. I think we'd all settled into what we thought was going to be a season of Sauber being last in the championship once again, and at least getting that prediction point in the bag. Then since Spain, the tables dramatically turned. He's been in the points every single race out of the last 4. He's leapfrogged his way into best of the rest contention just behind Albon in the standings, and has lifted Sauber to 6th in the constructors when, as I mentioned before, everyone predicted them to come comfortably last. And I don't know what magic Nico Hulkenberg is doing, but since coming back into the full-time Formula One grid a couple of seasons ago, he's had this golden touch. He came in when Haas were dreadful and made the Haas car look great last year, and now he's come into Sauber, who were dreadful last season, and is making them look pretty good, to the extent that I had him in my top 3 drivers for the 2024 season, and he might just be on his way to being in the top 3 drivers for 2025 as well. Even if he isn't quite best of the rest, which is still Alex Albon halfway through the season after his incredibly strong start to this campaign with 7 points finishes in the first 8 Grand Prix. Remember, in Miami, he was racing with the Ferraris, and he's continually been getting those 7th, 8th, 9th place finishes that you would expect from the driver beating the rest of the midfield, alongside the fact that Alex has managed to finish 5th on 3 occasions, which is why he's got such a good gap in the championship. We know that the Williams team said that they're now focused on 2026, and it's shown by the fact that the car's overall pace has certainly started to fall off as the rest of the pack have brought upgrades, and the fact that Alex Albon had 3 DNFs in a row in Spain, Canada and Austria due to the car falling apart. But he has beaten Sainz well in what many of us thought would be a really tough battle in his first real test since he was in a Red Bull. He's sitting pretty as best of the rest in the championship, and he has a reasonable gap to the majority of drivers behind him, as does Kimi Antonelli actually, whose season has followed a similar path to Alex Albon's season really, just for a few different reasons. He started the year by catching the eye with his pace, really solid point scoring positions above the midfield, but still behind the real big name front runners, kind of exactly where you want him to be, making 6th place his in 4 of the first 6 races, which you could argue peaked with that sprint race pole position in Miami, but since then it's been pretty awkward. 4 DNFs DNFs in the last 6 Grand Prix and an 18th place finish in Monaco after crashing in qualifying. You could say that not all of those have been his fault. The Mercedes has been very unreliable, but then you could also argue that those races were nothing special anyway. But he did get a podium in Canada, so there is still a lot of hope around him, and he is still a rookie, and the least experienced rookie at that, so he should get a little more leeway than some of the other drivers in the top teams that we're about to talk about. Although you could argue that Hamilton could be given some leeway too, considering how big of a change this season is for him after so long at Mercedes. I feel like the sprint win on pace in Shanghai in round 2 of the season promised something that we just haven't seen since. No podiums compared to his teammate who has 4, and I know that Hamilton has a couple of 4th place finishes, including when he lost his podium streak in Silverstone, where he was beaten to the podium by Hulkenberg, and a lot of his problems have come from the fact that he just doesn't seem to have faith in the car yet, shown by the fact that he has been out-qualified by Leclerc 8-4, which, considering how good Leclerc is in qualifying, isn't too bad, but he has consistently told us that he needs to use this season to get used to the new setup and help adjust the DNA of the Ferrari for 2026 if he is going to improve. Having said all that, he's only 16 points behind Leclerc, which isn't really that bad. Unfortunately for Lewis, Ferrari have fully Ferrari'd this campaign, and they've been very up and down in form. Not what we expected. And not what Charles Leclerc would have expected either, considering the discussions before the season were about whether he could battle with the McLarens for the championship this season, off the back of Ferrari improving so much in the second half of last year, and consistently good performances from Charles Leclerc throughout 2024. Instead, he's 5th in the championship and hasn't won a race yet in 2025. Although I'm in no way blaming Charles Leclerc for that, because he's continued his form from last season, qualifying well, beating his teammate almost always, and getting the best out of the car nearly every weekend. It is most definitely the car that has once again left Charles Leclerc to stare into the interview cameras after every race and contemplate what he did to deserve this level of torture. Every time it feels like he's within touching distance of a title fight, the Scuderia find a way to make sure that it just doesn't happen. But hey, next year, right? I suppose at least Leclerc knows he'll be staying where he is for the next year, because somehow the same can't be said for George Russell. It would be such a kick in the teeth for George if he managed to come into Mercedes just as their dominance from the last regulation cycle came to an end, and then is kicked from the team just as they have the chance to start a new era of dominance with the new regulations coming in. Especially because he's been really good. Every season that he's been at Mercedes, he's continued to improve and develop into a driver that is more than capable of being in the discussion for consistently winning races and even championships given the right car. He's finished in the top 5 on 9 occasions this season, 5 of those being podiums, and has only missed out on the point scoring places once, and that was in Monaco, which was due to a car fault in qualifying. There are not many drivers that I think you could argue would have been able to do much better than George Russell given the circumstances at Mercedes this season. Which leads us nicely onto maybe one of the drivers who could in Max Verstappen, who of course could be taking George's seat as the rumours of a Mercedes move are back once again and louder than ever this year, mainly due to the fact that we're not talking about Max last in this video. The team have lost basically all of their key personnel, with Horner being added to the pile alongside Newey, Wheatley, Courtney, Marshall, and probably more I'm forgetting, alongside how the Red Bull car has dropped from being the most dominant car we have ever seen in the sport 2 years ago to now being sometimes the 4th fastest. There really aren't many positives apart from the fact that Max and Max alone can seemingly make even a car with no rear end grip look passable and keep himself within the championship battle with the McLarens as long as he did. We have seen the absolute best from Max Verstappen at points. The win in Japan was stunning, and some of his qualifying laps this year have been jaw-dropping, but then we have also seen the other side of Verstappen, like in Spain, when I think he realised the championship fight was all but over, and then he lashed out by driving into George Russell. Dropping it behind the safety car in Silverstone was also a very un-Verstappen-like move, but you could point to the high-risk setup that they had on that car as the reason to why Verstappen lost it in the way that he did. However, despite the negatives, the team would have 7 points without Max, and let's say the lineup was Lawson and Tsunoda coming into this season, they could well be last in the championship, so they have to give him some credit for that. The penultimate driver on the list last, and actually closing in on top spot is Lando Norris. And what can we really say about Lando Norris at this point? It feels like he's had a season's worth of ups and downs within just half a season, whilst also making almost every single weekend as difficult as possible for himself. He started the year brilliantly, then seemed to struggle with the car whilst Piastri built a championship lead, winning 3 in a row. Then he seemed to be back on form in Imola and got a brilliant win in Monaco, only for that to then be countered by a Spain win for his teammate and a silly crash in Canada, which only he can be blamed for. But then he bounced back from that with the most dominant display possible in Austria and a well-navigated, if slightly lucky, win in Silverstone. It just feels like it's been all over the place, despite him only being off the podium twice this season so far, which I suppose you could put down to how quick the McLaren is compared to the rest of the field, but it does feel like this season has been worse for Lando Norris than it actually has in reality, I think because he still lacks that cutthroat edge in Q3. There have been more than a few weekends where it's felt like he's the fastest driver in practice, stomped through Q1 and Q2, only to not quite have that final 10th in Q3. But he is still very much involved in the championship battle, and it feels like a few things are starting to go in Lando's favour. I think it's likely that the Drivers' Championship trophy won't be handed out until the final race, and anything can happen when it comes to Abu Dhabi. Although having said that, that is dependent on Oscar Piastri not stepping it up another gear, because despite the heartbreak on home soil at the start of the year, looking back at the other 11 races, it's difficult to point to any weekend where Piastri hasn't been cool, calm and collected behind the wheel and absolutely maximised the potential of the car for that weekend. Need I remind you that this is only his 3rd season in the sport, and before this year he'd never even had a pole position to his name. Now he's been leading the championships in Saudi Arabia, which was way back in the middle of back-to-back-to-back wins for him, and he's only been off the podium once in Canada since he took the lead of the championship, and even that was a 4th place finish where his teammate and rival crashed out. The only thing that worries me is Piastri did start to lose his consistency in the second half of last year, and Lando Norris will continually be putting the pressure on Oscar because that McLaren car is just so good right now that they're only going to be battling for 1st and 2nd place most races. But from what we've seen so far, Oscar has been as good, if not better than we expected him to be this season, and is very much deserving of the highest grade possible. But let me know what you think in the comments down below. Who are you backing to win the championship? Of course, do you agree with these gradings? Who would you have had higher and who maybe a little bit lower? And of course, bring on the second half of 2025.